Not have that little jingle during the talks. Thank you very much for that. I just want to very briefly, again, thank the committee, affirm them for standing fast and working so hard in this conference. We'll be thanking them through the day. But I also want to give a special thanks to the person who's going to pray for us this morning, Father Alona. He is a Monsignor and is a rector at, is it St. Martin's Roman Catholic Church? And he's also with the Archdiocese and is in charge of interreligious and ecumenical dialogue. And I think for that reason, he was the target of a lot of harassment, pressure to urge him not to appear at the conference with us. And he decided, in the interest of justice, he has seen the situation firsthand, that this discussion needs to continue and people need to be educated about it. And he shared that information with his Archbishop, and he said, we need to be there. So I want to thank you for being with us and your steadfast support. So we welcome Father Alona. Come up. So he's going to get us started with prayer this morning, but we say affectionately in Arabic, Abuna. So you are Abuna. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much, Don. It's been a privilege for me to be here today and yesterday. I am to lead an invocation which I worked on diligently until my good friend Sally Macmillan gave me a better prayer. So let us ask the presence of God to be with us this day. May God bless you with discomfort at easy answers, half-truths, and superficial relationships so that you will live deep in your heart. May God bless you with anger at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of people and the earth so that you will work for justice, equity, and peace. May God bless you with tears to shed for those who suffer, so you will reach out your hands to comfort them and change their pain into joy. And may God bless you with a foolishness to think that you can make a difference in the world, so you will do the things which others say cannot be done. Amen.
Wonderful, thank you so much. A couple announcements and logistics, like usual. I'd like to call Jan up to make an announcement, if that's.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So I actually chose to be up here in this exalted spot, yeah. Because, I'm sorry, you can't hear? Ooh, let's do a sound check. How are we doing in the back? Gita, how are we doing in the back? Okay. Is Elio around? Yeah. We did a sound check this morning. Testing. Are we there now? Is it just okay, or is it okay? It's okay. All right. I will project. Well, in fact, what I was about to say was that the reason I think this is a fine place to be standing is that, we had Bible study yesterday with Naeem. This morning, we're going to have some preaching, and we're going to have some more scripture. And we're going to talk about the church. We've talked a lot about politics. We've talked a lot about human rights. Actually, that means or should mean that we've been talking about the church all along. But that's what we're going to talk about this morning. And so we are in church. Here I am up where people usually preach. I think that's just fine. I want to thank Friends of Sabeel North America, the wonderful organizers. It's great to be back here with many old friends from Albuquerque, and of course with Dick and Don. Sabeel, as I will go into a little bit as I go on, has been very, very important to me. So whenever I'm with Sabeel, I just feel like I am with the family, and it's the place that I need to be. This is family. This is a movement. We're all part of it. So in church, up here preaching, it's the place to be. I sometimes like to tell the story. I'll go a little bit into the question of what's a Jewish kid from Philadelphia doing, running around the country and the world speaking to Christians in churches about the New Testament and about Palestinian human rights. And it was on Cape Cod. We have some friends from Cape Cod with us here today. And it was in a Catholic church. Remember that night, Elaine? Were you there? And, when you're in church with Christians like to know, and you're from out of town or from another place, they want to know, like, where do you worship, right? Where do you worship? So somebody said to me, also a little bit curious about this Jewish guy turning up in the Catholic church, what's your synagogue? And I wasn't ready for the question. But it's when you get those questions that you're not prepared for that the real answers come out. I just looked at her, and I was standing, on the altar, in the nave. I said, you're sitting in it. This work, this cause, this is my worship. This is my way of being true and deeply connected to my tradition. It's my synagogue. Now, of course, we're in a Catholic church, right? So there's a crucifix. And there's the corpus right there. There is Jesus, larger than life. It was a big one. Suspended, in the nave on the altar over my right shoulder. And I said, and that visionary rabbi whose image hangs above my right shoulder, I know would endorse that statement. So welcome to our synagogue. And after the jaws dropped, people actually applauded. And it wasn't for me. It was because people were realizing that something important was happening here. Something about our traditions, something about him, something about what we're all doing here. So that is to say, again, welcome to our synagogue. We're here together, we're part of a movement, and we should be in church. That's what it's about. And that's what I really want to talk about. Maybe let's try this. And then we better turn this off. Right, let me step away from it. Is this better? Is this better? Is this on? It's better. Maybe if I put it up here. Is this better? Let me set it up. It's better.
Did you turn it on?
Yeah, it should be.
Okay, so did you kill that one? I'm still standing up here. I was in Holland. Turn up the volume. We do have people working on it behind the curtain. All right, I'm going to project. I am mic'd, right? You can. There is amplification, right? All right.
Maybe if you know that one that she was using earlier, that would seem to be.
Well, let's work on this one. So I was in Holland about a year ago. I was at a joint conference sponsored by Sabeel of the Netherlands, Friends of Sabeel Netherlands, and Kairos Netherlands. I'm going to talk a lot about Kairos. And there was a panel. And it was a panel to talk about the Kairos Palestine document. I was going to bring it up as Exhibit A, but you've all seen it. And if you haven't read it, you need to. And on this panel was a local church bureaucrat from the Netherlands Reformed Church. Basically, it's the big Protestant church of the Netherlands. They absorbed the Lutherans. It's most of the sort of mainline Reformed Christians in Holland. A few other people, and there was a local rabbi. So first the church official gets up, the church bureaucrat, maybe the number 2 guy. And he's a pastor, but they cycle through these administrative positions in the church. And he holds up the Kairos document that the Palestinians wrote, and he said, this is a wonderful document, and we need to be in solidarity with and support the Palestinians in their struggle, but I cannot support this document. I cannot support this document because it mentions boycotts. And we, speaking as a European, North European Christian, know what it's like to single out a particular people for punishment or for discrimination. We will not go down that road again. And I'll get back to that, because my next stop was Germany. And then the rabbi got up, and the rabbi said, this is a terrific document. We in the Jewish community support the Palestinians in their quest for self-determination, for their own state, for human dignity and human rights. But I cannot support this document. I cannot support this document because it gives us the Palestinian story, but it leaves out the Jewish narrative. Now, I'll get back to the church guy in a minute, but I just want to say something quickly about the rabbi. If I'd had a chance to talk to him afterwards, I would have said to him, or if I'd been on that panel, I would have said, Rabbi, you're wrong. This document, written by the Palestinians, that talks about the sin of the occupation and talks about their suffering and reaches out in love, in resistance with the logic of love, right, to the Israelis and to the Jewish people. This is my narrative. This is the Jewish narrative of today. And I would remind you of what Miko said. Actually, he didn't say it yesterday, but if you ever saw his YouTube video, which I saw, many people saw years ago, and thank goodness Miko is now full-time committed to the cause. What he says is that the Jewish people is in deep trouble, that Zionism is killing our soul, and that someday we will be on our knees in contrition for what we have done. I'll never forget that line from him. I said, I got to meet this man, this Jewish Israeli man. That's where we are in the Jewish community today. Someday we will be on our knees in contrition, on Yom Kippur, beating our breasts for what we have done and what we continue to do. But I'm really not here to talk about the Jewish people. I'm here to talk about the church. My next stop was Germany, and how many of you here know the Monty Python sketch? Actually, it's not Monty Python, it's Fawlty Towers, right? Where the John Cleese character, the Germans are coming to the bed and breakfast, right? And everybody says to him, okay, then the Germans are coming to your bed and breakfast in England somewhere. Don't talk about the war. Remember, it makes Germans very, very upset. And of course, John Cleese, in his brilliant way, goes absolutely nuts and out of control, and he ends up goose-stepping around the table where the Germans are trying to have their breakfast. And it's very, very funny. Okay, so I turn up in Germany because my book was translated into German. It's interesting. It got picked up by the Germans in about 6 weeks. It took me about a year to find a publisher here in this country. It's interesting. So I'm on a book tour. And local activists are organizing talks for me in different German cities. So I think the first stop was Stuttgart. There's a very active sort of pro-justice solidarity with Palestinian group there. It's all church-oriented. In fact, I was talking in a Catholic church, and the organizers came up to me before, and they said, don't talk about boycott. Germans are it's very sensitive here. Don't talk about boycotting Israel. It brings up bad memories. It's just, don't do it. So I thought, I'm not supposed to talk about BDS? I said, okay, well, we'll see. But I listened to them. I mean, these are my hosts. They supposedly know more than I do. I stand up in front of this group. It was standing room only. They just came out to hear me. And it was with an interpreter. I mean, it's difficult. Within 10 minutes, I don't know what it was, but you get the sense of an audience. Within 10 minutes, I was talking about boycott. And I told them the story of the church guy in Holland. And I said to them, look, how many of you, I'd like a show of hands, how many of you confuse the anti-Jewish laws in the 30s of the Third Reich with the international campaign to boycott Israel to stop its illegal occupation of the Palestinians and its illegal ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians? How many of you confuse those two things? There were no hands. I said, I'll tell you what, I'll make a deal with you. I will stop playing the role of the world's biggest victim if you will stop being the world's greatest criminals. Let's move on. And this became the theme of my entire time in Germany. There is a hunger there. Nobody wants to feel like they are guilty all the time. Now, these are the two issues that have to be talked about if our movement is going to grow, and it is growing, and it is going to grow. It was right there in that panel in Holland. Because what that church bureaucrat in the Netherlands was speaking, well, you know what he was talking about, right? It pervades our society as well. Christians can't move because of what they did to the Jews. And the church cannot take on its sacred mission, which it's taken on before, and I'll talk about that. In this case, it's blocked. And of course, we experienced it, in a small way here in Albuquerque, putting on this conference. So that's the first issue. It's often the elephant in the room. I call it the interfaith industry, with apologies to Norman Finkelstein. The second issue is the Jewish people themselves, ourselves. And our inability to step out of our own box, our own mythology, our own identity, which, as Miko pointed out very, very well yesterday, is based on the myth of Jewish vulnerability. It's not just Israeli vulnerability, it's Jewish vulnerability. It's right around the corner. Now, I know this well. I was raised on this. I was born in 1948 in Philadelphia. If you're a Jewish kid born in this country, in a fairly traditional family, in a very strong Jewish community, Philadelphia, very strong, you are raised in a very, very potent combination of traditional rabbinic Judaism and political Zionism. The two are not separate. As has been pointed out, you've got both flags on the pulpit. We pray to Israel. And I was told that I had been blessed to have been born at a time when my people had been redeemed from 2,000 years of suffering and persecution and slaughter. It was over. And, it's as we say in the Passover liturgy, many of you maybe have been at Passover Seders. In every generation, a tyrant rises up to oppress us, and the Lord God stretches out his hands and saves us from them. So it's not just the Nazis. It's not just the 20th century. That's our history. That's our identity. Now, it's wonderful to be Jewish, and we have a wonderful tradition. But as you know, every tradition has its dark side. This is our dark side. It's an identity based on the sense that everybody out there is out to get us. And what I was raised with was a sense of brittle And I have to say it's superiority. Not only do we suffer more, but we're kind of better than those vicious, drunken hordes, that's you guys, who are out there to get me. That's what my grandmother felt. She came from such an environment, but it's in the DNA and it got transmitted to me. And I was taught that I had two enemies, two mortal enemies, the German people because of what they did to us, and the Arabs, as we called them, because of what they would do to us if we didn't have Israel. So the myth, and again, Miko laid it out for you very well yesterday, the myth of Israel's birth and what Israel means to the Jewish people and to Jewish identity very, very much partakes of the Jewish identity and Jewish history and Jewish culture. And I bought it. What was there not to buy? I was blessed. I was special. I'd been given this gift. My people had been redeemed. There was Paul Newman. I mean, this great stuff. Until I saw the occupation. Until I experienced the Nakba and realized that, in fact, there was a Jewish narrative, and in fact, it was my narrative, until I met that so-called enemy, the Palestinians, and realized that they did not hate me, they did not fear me, they were angry, they were bitter, but it was, ahlan wa sahlan, thank you for coming, let's talk, let's live together. This was the enemy. And I had, this is not long ago. This was with the Fellowship of Reconciliation in 2006. And I was staying with my aunt and uncle in West Jerusalem. I have a vast family there because my grandfather was born there. And he emigrated to this country. I was born here. My mother was born here, but the family roots go back there. And I realized that I didn't want to be in West Jerusalem anymore. I wanted to be in East Jerusalem with the Palestinians, with the Muslims, with the Christians. And I wondered what was happening to me. Was I supposed to convert? Was I supposed to stop being a Jew? It's a longer story. I don't want to go into it. I talk a lot about it in my book, which is half memoir. But walking into Sabeel in East Jerusalem one day and listening to Nora Karmi introduced me to the Sabeel theology, to the Sabeel story, was what gave me the answer of what was happening to me. I learned about Jesus. Of course, Jesus. I mean, I wasn't supposed to even walk into a church much less talk about Jesus. Christians were dangerous. You were either going to kill us or convert us. It was never quite clear what was the worst outcome. Yeah. I learned about Jesus, who was a Palestinian Jew who lived under Roman occupation, who was speaking truth to power in the prophetic tradition, the prophets that I knew, that I had been raised on. I picked up Naeem's book on the way out. I read it cover to cover in about 2 hours. It's his first book. It's a short book. It's still, frankly, my favorite. And I realized that what I was feeling about wanting to be with the Palestinians and wanting to devote my life to working for justice for the Palestinians did not mean that I was going to not be Jewish anymore. It meant that I was becoming the Jew I'd always been taught to be, and that it was the most Jewish thing that I could become, and it was the most Jewish thing that I could do, and that these barriers between these religions, cultures, peoples, whatever we want to call them, needed to come down. Certainly they were coming down inside me. I came home because my covenant was to speak about my experience. And of course, the doors of the synagogues did not exactly fling open in welcome to hear my message, but the churches, and Christians were now my network, because I went with FOR, were there, and they wanted to hear it. And they heard my message, my story, and then my talking about the occupation, with what I could only describe as hunger and enormous gratitude. Tell us the story. We know it's right. We want to be liberated to be able to go ahead and take this cause on. We know it's the right thing. And then I learned about what the barrier to that was. And the barrier was, I have to say it was historical and it was theological. The pastor came up to me after my talk at one of the first churches I ever spoke at. Many of you have heard me tell the story. And he said to me, look, I agree with you, but we can't go there. We have to be very sensitive to the Jews and what Jewish people feel about this. And very naively, I said to him, what do you mean? And he said, look, I have spent my entire life as a pastor, a Presbyterian pastor, big Presbyterian church in Washington, working for human rights. And I work with an interfaith group, imams, rabbis, other pastors and priests on this. We don't touch Palestine out of respect for the rabbis. And then it was like, this was my Paul on the road to Damascus moment. I did not know I had these words in my head. But I looked at him and I said, because the dime dropped, I got it. Pastor, you have to do something else with your Christian guilt. Appreciate your sensitive feelings toward my people, okay? But these rabbis who are saying we can't talk about Israel, you have to talk about it very carefully, are not friends of Israel, and they're not friends of the Jewish people. We're in big trouble. We've got to figure this out, and we've got to acknowledge what we've done. And the priests and the pastors, the Christian clergy, who enable that, and I use that word, those of you who have been part of the 12-step and substance abuse self-help programs know what it means to be an enabler, right? The pastors, you, who are enabling this by saying, okay, we won't talk about it, are not being friends of the Jewish people and are not being friends of Israel. And he's like, who's this guy lecturing to me? But I wasn't finished. I said, this is not what Jesus wants you to do. So what's this Jewish psychologist doing lecturing this Presbyterian pastor about what Jesus wants him to do? Yeah, speaking the truth. I was preaching to him. And I realized that I was finding a voice. And that I got it. I understood what was going on there. I was starting to understand what it meant for me. I was starting to get, and this is what I really want to talk about, I was starting to get a sense that in these churches, with these people coming to hear talks about Palestine, was an enormous power, an enormous force, because the church is organized. And these Christians who I was meeting in these churches anyway knew what it meant to be a Christian. It didn't mean going to church on Sunday, hearing an empty sermon, and going back to your life. It meant Matthew 25. It meant the Great Commission. It meant discipleship. It meant going out and changing the world, whether it's in your backyard or whether it's across the globe. And then I started to realize that that's what we needed to do, and that's where the power would be. I put that together with the fact that it's America and it's the United States that's responsible for what's going on in Gaza and in Jenin and in Bethlehem, and that it starts and ends in Washington. And you've got the churches here in the United States. And I'll say this 10 times before I'm done today. The churches have done it before. It was the tipping point for South Africa. And where did the civil rights movement start here? Who were the leaders? They were pastors, and it was a Christian movement. And King makes that so clear and so explicit in all his writings, and the people who worked for him and the people who worked with him. And Ida Mae Hamer, who she led a movement with gospel songs. It's a Christian movement. That's what gave it its power and its force. And then it spread to the white churches, and then it spread throughout our entire society. And then the Jewish kids were getting on the Freedom Rider buses, and it became a secular movement, but it always retained that core. It was the churches. And it's the churches now. There's no doubt in my mind. And this is not based on theology. This is based on theology, but it's a strategic point. It's a movement-building point. Okay, I'm desperately trying to get back to my notes here. I started, this pastor who wanted me to be quiet, or didn't want me to be quiet, but wanted me to be careful, started to give me books to read about why it is that the Jews are so important and we have to be so sensitive to them when we talk about Israel and Palestine, and that trumps human rights, which is basically what he was saying. And we've had talks about this. It was his penitence, but it was also the fact that Christianity, in its penitence after the war, had to fix its theology, had to get rid of all the toxic, not unchristian, anti-Jewish doctrine. And that's true. Never belonged to Christianity. It was an artifact of what was happening historically in the 1st and 2nd centuries. It never belonged. And yet, it overtook the faith and ended up with the Holocaust, with the Nazi Holocaust. There's no question about it. So he started giving me this stuff to read. And I realized that what had happened after World War II was that Christian theology did a complete about-face about the Jews. And in fact, instead of the Jews being in the basement and being damned and condemned to be stateless and to be persecuted because they had sinned against God by rejecting, his only begotten Son and rejecting the good news, all of that narrative, he said, it's not true. In fact, the Jews are God's blessed. The original covenant with Abraham is in place. And by the way, there's a real estate clause in that covenant. And we have to honor it. So it's really nice, actually. We've sinned against the Jews for 2,000 years. That was bad. We're really sorry. Take this gift. Take this guilt offering. And, Don talks about this a lot. If you really take a look at Christian Zionism, I think it's about the most anti-Semitic doctrine I've ever read. It's not nice for the Jews. It's not good for the Jews. It's taking us, it's putting us on a pedestal, it's telling us to go over there. And it's unchristian. There's a guy in Chicago, John Palikowski, who is a very, very well-known Catholic theologian who writes about interfaith. That's sort of his area. And I started to read him. I've still never met him. I would love to have a conversation with him someday. He said the 1993, I think it was, Vatican's recognition of the state of Israel was the last nail in the coffin of replacement theology. So you understand what he's saying? When we recognize Israel, we make up for all the anti-Semitism. Now, that's absolutely wrong, because Israel is not Judaism, A. B, it's a renunciation and 3 steps backwards from the core, what I understand to be and believe to be the core of what Christianity is about. Jesus stood in front of the temple in the beginning of the last week of his life on earth and said to his disciples, destroy this temple. In another gospel, he says, in 3 days, not one stone will be left upon another. He was talking about the empire, and he was talking about the client government, the Jewish client government that was working for Rome, that was taking the people away from the Torah, from the essentials of their belief as Jews. He was saying, this comes down. Now, the disciples, of course, if you remember the scene, are totally clueless about what he's talking about. They're saying, Master, what are you saying? This has been a massive remodeling project taking place for the last 46 years. How can you rebuild it in 3 days? So of course they didn't get it. And so the narrator in the Gospel of John, just to make it very, very clear to those of us, like we're 6 years old, he was speaking of the temple of his body of Christ, one humanity united in a common communion. The widow, the orphan, the oppressed, all of us together. The temple is replaced by that. It's the kingdom. So Jesus was making a very political statement. That's Christianity. God living in one place, over. A particular family or a particular tribe having a piece of land, and that being the core of what we believe in and building a whole religion and a whole cult around that, over. When we get to Pentecost, we learn more about what was really supposed to happen, and we'll talk about that, but that's Christianity. It lifted Judaism out of its tribal roots and took it where it was supposed to go. Jesus was a Jew. He was a Jewish reformer. He was talking about Judaism. Unfortunately, things being the way they were, it ended up that the followers of Jesus became something called Christians, started a whole new, quote, religion. The Jews stayed back in their own tribal isolationism. And we went off from there. And then, of course, within a couple hundred years, Christianity was back in the temple again, of course. But we're coming back together again. Both faiths. Islam is another issue. We don't have time to talk about it very much. This is an opportunity. That's what this Kairos is about. So I want to talk about Kairos a bit. I knew from my reading at that point that theology was an issue, it was a barrier. If the church was going to be liberated to do what it needed to do, we needed to deal with these issues. We needed to talk about the elephant in the room. We needed to talk about theology. And Christians had to become apologetically Christian again and separate that from the whole penitential impulse to make up for what you did to the Jews. That's cheap penitence, with apologies to Bonhoeffer. It's cheap penitence. You don't fix what's wrong with yourselves by going off and taking care of another group and elevating them and giving them a guilt offering without looking at what's wrong inside yourself. The church has to re-embrace what's most true and what's most important about the church. And I started to find out what that was. In 2009, I found myself in Bethlehem at the launch of the Kairos Palestine document sponsored by the World Council of Churches, Palestine-Israel Ecumenical Forum. And it was a great event. It was wonderful. But what left the biggest impression on me when I was there was the South Africans in the room. It was very ecumenical and international. There were about 3 or 4 South Africans, almost all clergy, black and white, and colored. You have to use that word when you're talking about South Africa, because they still do. And they were the most prophetic people in the room. There were Presbyterians there, and they were kvetching. You know what this means? It's a Presbyterian term, right? They were kvetching. They were complaining about the fact that the Palestine Kairos document mentioned BDS. I don't know if we can take this home. Mentions BDS. And the South African said, that's where you're going. That's what will work. You're embarking on a struggle with your own churches. Get ready. It's messy. It takes a long time. It took us 40 years. Get ready. And I listened to them because I knew that they were the people who had the answer. A year and a half later, I found myself in South Africa at a meeting sponsored by the South Africa Kairos people. These were the same people who brought down apartheid 20 years before. And they invited a group of Palestinians. And it was an encounter between the Palestinians who had written the Kairos document and the South Africans who were embracing the Kairos document. It was amazing. For one thing, I learned about what they did in the 80s. And I learned about the first 20th century Kairos document that sort of the Palestinian document is named after. It's called Challenge to the Church. We'll go into it in more depth in the workshop. But note, it's called Challenge to the Church. They did not address the South African government, although they called it a tyranny. They addressed their own people, and they confessed that the church had invented apartheid, that out of its own weakness, it had acceded to separating whites and blacks in the church, that it had provided a theology that established a civil religion that the Afrikaners, when they took power in 1948, could adopt, and that they were complicit and basically responsible for apartheid. And they said no more. We are not with Jesus as long as we do not confess this and say it has to be over. This had happened 2 years before at the World Alliance of Reformed Churches, when 9 black and colored pastors turned up in Ottawa, Canada for the International Conference of the World Alliance of Reformed Churches, and they had planned this. This was 1983, 1982. They said, we will not sit at the Lord's Supper with you because you're white and we're black and we can't do that at home. Communion is segregated at home in South Africa. And to their credit, the World Alliance of Reformed Churches leadership said, oh my God. We are in this, they officially said, we are in status confessionis. We're not all Latin scholars here, but you know what that means. Nothing moves until we fix this basic challenge to the core of what we believe about the unity of humankind. And they did the Protestant equivalent of excommunication, and they suspended the member churches in South Africa. They said this is a heresy. A heresy. And within 11 years, apartheid was over. The church did it. It had that act, and then it spread ecumenically. It wasn't just the Reformed churches. That act had a major impact on the rest of the nations of the world, especially the Thatcher government and the Reagan government, in establishing the sanctions and bringing the government to the table. The church did it. In this document, they talk about church theology. What is our, quote, church theology that has supported this evil? They just unpack just 3 words that they say that have been appropriated to support the tyranny. One is reconciliation. They say, what's reconciliation? Reconciliation means, can't we just sit and talk about it? Let's bring the 2 sides together. We'll understand that we don't have to be enemies and all will be well. Sound familiar? They deconstruct this in that document. Then they talk about justice. They say, justice, for the church, we support the justice of reform. Reform in that context was, we'll put blacks in the legislature, and we'll give them their own homelands and install our own client governors. That will be reform. In other words, it's not to fix the injustice, it's to preserve the unjust system. It was a 2-state solution. That's exactly what was on the table in the 80s in South Africa. And the church said no. And that made the difference. And that's our context, folks. They talk about nonviolence. Oh, we support nonviolence. But who are the violent ones? It's the kids in the townships. Okay? It's not the tanks coming into the townships and the military coming in to crush them. Okay? Sound familiar, folks? It's not the state violence. It's the rising up of the oppressed. Those are the violent people. They shouldn't be violent. So it's all there for us. It's a blueprint. So what I realized in South Africa was, okay, you've got Kairos, Palestine. Now you got Kairos, Southern Africa. You've got them springing up in India, in Latin America, in other parts of Asia, and in Europe. Where's Kairos, USA? If we don't have one, if the American church doesn't do this, doesn't join that international movement in response to the Palestinian call, well, then. And I knew that that's what we needed to do, and that's what I needed to bring home. I ran into Don at a Churches Middle East Peace Conference a couple of weeks later. We said, this isn't it anymore. We need Kairos USA. We hooked up with a bunch of other usual suspects in Chicago, which has a wonderful activist community, working on it for decades, and we started Kairos USA. And the document that you will have, everybody here will have in their hands before you leave, take a few, is the U.S. response to that. And we did it in less than a year. It was the spirit that made this happen. So let me tell you a little bit more about it. I want to make sure there's a little bit of time for questions. So I won't talk much about one thing I wanted to talk about, which was the context that we're facing here. We've had our own experience here about resistance and opposition and lies about Fasna, right? About Sabeel, okay? They tell lies, okay? And they tell lies about the Palestinians. But the biggest lies are not about Sabeel, and not about our own movement here, and not about Palestinian human rights, okay? The Palestinians will get their human rights. It will happen. It has to. What's being attacked now in our context, in response to our movement, and in response to the fact that people are reading the Palestinian document, what's being attacked by people in the Jewish community who claim to speak for all Jews, and people in the churches who are afraid of upsetting the institution and want to keep the temple intact. What's being attacked is Jesus. It's the Gospels. It's what Christianity and the church is supposed to be about. Case in point, before the Presbyterian General Assembly in 2010, there was an article that came out in Christian Century by Amy Jo Levine and a junior person at Vanderbilt. Amy Jo Levine is a Jewish scholar. She is full professor of New Testament at Vanderbilt Seminary. It's a whole other story about how the academy is now captive to this, to Zionism. And they wrote a paper in opposition to this report that was going to be adopted by the Presbyterian General Assembly. That was a report about the occupation. It was about what was going on in Palestine and Israel. And it was very critical and said, we have to take a stand against this. And then the title of the report was Breaking Down the Walls. It was a reference to Ephesians 2, breaking down the walls of hostility that have separated us. And they said, oh, can't you see? Breaking down the walls means you want to break down the wall that we built between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and you want to establish a Palestinian state and wipe out Israel. My friends, this is what they said. In the same article, they talk about the fact that Palestinians and people in the movement talk about come and see. Come and see. Come on pilgrimages. Meet us. Talk to us. They said, oh, no. That's another New Testament reference, and it has to do with the end times, about how the Jews are all going to be destroyed. Don't you see that this is all anti-Semitism, and it's all about the destruction of Israel? Don't believe what your own people are telling you. We will define for you how you should understand your own tradition. The UMC now and the Presbyterians just barely managed to get defeated the divestment initiatives. What's the alternative? Positive investment. Build our prison for us. Okay, again, this is happening by the Jewish establishment and by powerful forces within the church. And lately, the Palestinian document itself is being attacked as espousing archaic, hateful anti-Semitism and wanting to destroy the state of Israel. Now, you won't find any of that in the document. The document is wonderful. It's terrific theology. It's liberation theology. And I always wonder, why do we call it liberation theology? It's theology, right? Why does a theology that basically talks about Matthew 25 and the Great Commission and everything that Jesus said have to have a descriptor attached to it saying this is liberation theology? What's the other theology? Well, positive investment, that's another theology. Christian Zionism, that's another theology. The theology we have to do is the theology that is articulated beautifully in the Palestinian document. And it is being attacked. So that's what's at stake here. It's bigger than Palestine. And it's bigger than the church, but it falls on the church right now. Which is why, and you've heard me say this over and over again, this is not an interfaith issue. Interfaith has come to become an industry, and it's all about, I have become fond of saying, it's all about Christians and Jews getting together and Christians basically kissing the Jews' ring, or maybe some other part. Let's talk about what's wonderful about both our traditions. Let's honor the differences, celebrate the commonalities, but let's not talk about what's really important. So interfaith has become a barrier. Someday, inshallah, that will not be true. It really falls on the church now, which is why this document, the Kairos USA document, is a Christian document. It is not signed by Jews. It's a Christian document. It's about the church getting its own house in order. And the Jews who are with you here today, Miko and Sydney and myself and Becca and others, we are not here to bless your efforts. We are not here to cover for you, because you can say the Jewish community is with us. We're here to help. It's your struggle. So, all right, and a few minutes left to me. Well, let me give you another piece of scripture, which I think is really important. One thing that the South Africans told me when I was there, I was sitting with the greats. I was sitting with people who had seen half of their friends, the church people, half their friends die, who had themselves spent time in jail, who had been through hell and come out the other side. And I'm sitting in their presence. I mean, I was awed. I said, okay, please, tell us how you did it. I want to bring this message back to the American church because it's about Washington. American Christians have a huge responsibility. They told me many things, but they said, okay, listen, be very, very clear about this. We were never united. Sometimes it felt like just a handful of us in the forefront struggling with the rest of the church people and our denominations and our bishops and our superiors and all of that, saying stop and we'll throw you out. It was a church struggle. And that is so, and that is clear here as well. It's a church struggle. And that's what peace is all about, and that's what being faithful to the Gospels is all about, and that's what the Great Commission is all about. Jesus said, do you think that I have come to bring peace? Not at all. I've come to bring division. Now, Jesus, it's a hard verse, right? He wasn't saying you should fight with each other. When in the other gospel where he says, I've come to bring a sword, he's not talking about cutting people apart. He was saying, peace will only happen when you know the difference. That's the word in Greek. When you know how to separate this from that, and which side are you going to be on? So if you want to be in a movement, I'm preaching to the choir here. If you want to be in a movement, but you don't want to be getting that kind of resistance and being involved in that kind of a struggle, you got to find another movement. And they're out there where there's no argument about what you're doing. There's a big argument going on about this. And it's going to get worse. We ain't seen nothing yet. And now, with Kairos USA coming, and really bringing the Palestinian story and bringing this theology, we ain't seen nothing yet. There are powerful forces that are threatened. So we have to really, we have to be ready for this. I was going to quote from the letter from the Birmingham jail where Martin Luther King, here, let me grab it. He said, because, a lot of the resistance and the opposition that we face masquerades as progressivism and sort of reconciliation, right? Listen to what King says. The Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white Citizens Council or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. And that is a peace with a sword. And we'll see more and more attempts. Positive investment, right? It's a moderate position, but it ain't going to work. And for people who oppose boycott, right, I would say to them, what part of Montgomery bus boycott do you not understand? What word do you not understand? It's clear. It's absolutely clear. And when Martin Luther King sat in that jail, remember the context. Of course, he's in jail for civil disobedience, sit-ins or something. And he gets this letter, a call to unity, from, I think it was 9 white clergy. One of them was a rabbi. It said, let's have a peace process, Martin. Just back off. This is not going to work. You're hurting the cause. You're alienating the people who can help us. And you know what he said. He said, you were always, this is, the early Christians knew they were a colony of heaven. Yes, they were dismissed and vilified as outside agitators. That's exactly what we have to do as Christians. This is what will work. So we have to, it was 50 years ago. We're coming up to the 50th anniversary of that letter. It speaks right to us. It speaks right to us. So, let me just say quickly what Kairos USA does. You can come to the workshop or not. It's all there for you to study, and there's also a flyer for a study guide which is coming out. It needs to get into the churches. It needs to get into your local grassroots organizations. It needs to get into your schools. This is a document that is really powerful because people say, well, why do we need another Kairos document? We have the Palestinian document. It's a different context. The Palestinian document is the cry of the oppressed. The U.S. document is the confession of the complicit. And we have contextual issues that we have to deal with. So what do we do in this document? First of all, we talk about Kairos theology. We teach Kairos theology. We start with the Bible. We talk about South Africa. We talk about the Palestinian document. And it's become a global movement. So we're part of a global movement. You know, I'm visiting Germany. I'm visiting Holland. It's happening in India. It's happening all over the world. This is part of a global Kairos movement. It is a response to Palestine. But every group in its own context is dealing with its own stuff. It empowers us to do better here by connecting to people over there. It takes on particular theological issues. Christian Zionism takes it on. The kind that's hiding in the mainstream, not John Hagee. We don't care about him. It talks about replacement theology. Basically, it says, in an unapologetic Christian way, we do not feel that the church has replaced the Jews. That's a silly concept. We feel that the church is the fulfillment of the Bible. And here's why. And it's all about universality. And unapologetically takes that on and begins the basis of study for that. And then it talks about the elephant in the room, which is the interfaith issue. Takes it right on. It says, we confess what we did to the Jews. This is not about that. And we feel that the most loving thing that we can do for the Jewish people is to invite you to join us in working for justice for all the peoples of that land, including the Israeli Jews. And so it takes that on, and it brings it right to the grassroots, and it names it, which means that not everybody's going to sign it, right? We brought a sword. And it's not, you know, you've seen a lot of these documents that the denominations put out. I mean, they're fine, but they hold back. And the time for holding back is over. We have to change those rules. Most importantly, it unifies. I don't call this an ecumenical document. Ecumenical is like, we think about ecumenical, we sort of think about a United Nations of Christianity. Here's our Presbyterian, there's a Presbyterian hat, here's the Quaker, here's the Catholic. The most important thing about this is that there's a strong, strong representation of evangelicals in this movement who have been part of the writing of the document, who are taking it forward. And they've been on this for years, you know? And most mainline people don't know that. And the evangelicals don't know that the Presbyterians and Methodists and Episcopalians have been working on this as well. They said, well, and I tell them that. And they say, really? Well, will they talk to us? You know? And then the Presbyterians say, well, the evangelicals, will they talk to us? Everybody thinks everybody else is a heretic. This is a unifying, enlivening, redemptive issue for the church. And it's bringing the black churches in as well. That's a whole other story. I don't have time to talk about it. It's a powerful constituency. And black Americans are ready to be brought in to this. There are some theological issues that have to be resolved, having to do with blacks' loyalty to the Jewish community for being with them during the civil rights movement, having to do with Exodus theology and all kinds of stuff. But when African Americans go over there and see what's happening, it takes about 2 seconds, and they know what to do and they know what's going on. And then we talk about, and the document talks about action. And there's 7 action points. It talks about bringing it into congregational life, prayer, liturgy. It talks about education. It talks about come and see. It talks about political advocacy. And then it talks about BDS. And it's very strong on BDS, which is another reason why some people won't sign it. It doesn't say go out and do BDS. It just talks about why BDS is okay. And that has nothing to do with vengeance or destructive feelings Back to the church guy in Holland. It makes that distinction very, very clear. That's another important piece of work that needs to be done, and this document handles it. So, if people are kind to me, we may still have time for questions. I just want to end up with this. It's Sunday, folks. We've seen something. We've seen something. And it's time to take it forward. It's a lot like Pentecost, where, of course, the apostles were very confused about what the kingdom was, right? They said, when's it coming, Lord? When's it coming, Lord? And he says, just wait. And when does it come? How does the Spirit descend on them? They can speak all the languages in the world, which it was just pointed out to me recently, includes Arabic. Go back to Acts chapter 2. It's in that list. And then Jesus says, now you have it. Go out to Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. They thought the kingdom meant, oh, you're going to bring back our kingdom. We're going to defeat Rome. We'll be in charge again. The ends of the earth, folks. The land has done its job. It's over. All the theology is there. But I wanted to talk about Matthew 5, verse 48, where Jesus says, love your enemies. And if you go to the end of that verse, he says, so that you will be perfect like your Father in heaven. Okay? And having studied Greek when I was in college and always liking to go back to that, I said, what's the word that says, what's perfect in the Greek? Anybody, who's the scholar? Who knows? What's the word? What's the Greek word for perfect in that verse? It's telos. Telos. Teloi. End. It's the end. It's where you get to in the end. It's where we are going. That's the eschaton. And guess what? It ain't perfect. We're doing that today. We're doing that every day. Every day is Sunday. Every day is resurrection. It's not going to be perfect. It's messy. It's long. And people talk about, what's the end game that we're asking for? We had a wonderful ad hoc conversation in the speaker's room yesterday. What's the end game? Is it one state? Is it two states? We're done with the two-state and one-state conversation, right? We agree about that. We have one state. It's called Israel. It's an apartheid state. Our job is to figure out what to do about that. And it's messy, and we don't know what will come about it, what will come of it, and how it will work itself out, but we know it will, and we know we have no choice but to go forward and to say it's not legitimate. We are not with Jesus or whoever we want to talk about that. We're not with our souls, with our values, until we take that step and until we stand very, very clearly about that. That's the bringing of the kingdom. And so we'll end with the Gospel of Martin, who near the end of the letter to the Birmingham jail addresses his interlocutors and says, the judgment of God is upon the church as never before. Again, he's speaking to the church. The judgment of God is upon the church as never before. If the church does not reclaim the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authenticity. It will forfeit the loyalty of millions. And it will be dismissed as a social club with no relevance for the 20th century. So these words ring out to us over the 5 decades. It's Sunday. We're working for the kingdom. Let's go on. Thank you.